Friday night's video in our master series. This is the 99th video in our master series, the 12th video in our subgroup mixing, and the 4th video in our backing tracks. So in this video, what we're going to talk about is a very unique roll. So this roll, let's look at this roll a couple of different ways. The first thing is this can be, we talked about your drums and your bass. Now those, if we look at them like they're really backing tracks and they're back in the mix, they're just holding the rhythm section down. You've got out front vocals and support tracks. Then you've got these other type of backing tracks like guitar. So if you didn't do like what we talked about in Master Series 96, and you've got, let's say, the guitar or the piano, it doesn't matter, either one, and these are going to be backing tracks, but they can very much cross the boundary into almost being supportive tracks. And the reason why is because it's musical. So the issue here is that the guitar or the piano that you've done some stuff with, that it's going to be interplaying, musically with what's happening with the vocal and the supporting tracks, creating harmonies, creating, counterpoint, things like that are very musical, that you don't sometimes want them really prominent so that they take away from what's the out front track and the supporting tracks, but you still want them pretty clear and you want them to be heard well so that interplay is audible. Does that make sense? So that, it can perform, what its role is. Because if you've got some really good musicians and they've really worked out, what the musical content is happening there, so that there is this interplay going on, counterpoint and harmonies and all kinds of things happening with these backing tracks. It could be like the guitar or piano happening with the out front vocal and the supporting tracks, that you don't want that to get lost in the mix. So really keep that in mind, because it can very much determine, how you're going to mix them in. So that's a huge factor to take into consideration. So, and also your bass can also be doing some of that also. And so it can sometimes jump out of just the rhythm element and into the musical element. So when it is doing that and it's very prominent and you very much want that to be heard, that you have to take that into consideration. But for the most part, that these tracks, the biggest consideration, like I talked about there, is you just have to really keep that in mind, what we were just talking about. And the next thing is controlling dynamics. These supportive tracks can sometimes, they're going to be more than likely beneath your out front tracks and your support tracks, but these backing tracks, they're very close to becoming supportive in some ways because of the harmonic or the musical interplay between what those things are on top of it. So having control of their dynamics is very important, so that I'm not saying squish the heck out of them, because you want some dynamic things happen, but you don't want them out of control so that you later on have an automation problem that you have to go back in with your vocals and your out front vocals, say for instance in your out front harmony tracks, your vocal harmony tracks, and doing a bunch of automation stuff with them to try to keep them up above what the guitar was doing and the piano was doing, because their dynamics are out of control and jumping up here and there where you didn't want them. And so putting a maximizer on those tracks or compressing them down a little bit so that you can control their dynamics is sometimes a really good idea. Because sometimes, you might have this guitar chord that's going to happen right here. And, well, you've compressed it down a little bit to try to tame the dynamics, but you really want it a little bit louder there. It's really easy to just go in there with automation and kick it up a little bit with automation, the volume level right there, because it's, you've tamed it a little bit too much. But there's this problem that, well, that's great for this whole section here, but right here I want it a little bit louder. It's much better to turn that up a little bit there later than have to go through and tame all of this with automation, or do automation with your out front vocal, trying to keep it up a ride and above, what's going on those backing tracks, like say the guitar and piano. So really keep that in mind. The other thing is you kind of want to, it's real debatable whether you want these types of backing tracks to blend into the production and become some type of a wash, how much of that do you want to happen, or how much you want them to really preserve their clarity. Does that make sense? And because sometimes one or the other is a really good idea depending on what the production is happening. So, really keep those things in mind when you're deciding what you're doing with these backing tracks. The other thing is we've talked about you can do any of the things that we talked about so far in the subgroup mixing to these backing tracks. Just keep in mind a couple different things. The first thing you want to keep in mind is that the more instruments you have in a production, the less complicated of things you're going to want to do so that you don't muddy the mix, so that you don't just get too much going on that causes mud that just reduces clarity to the point of it not sounding good. So really keep that in mind, and what also is that you can change that up. So all the things that we've talked about so far in subgroup mixing, that you can do that to this also differently in different sections to come up some really cool things. You might have this intro thing and you've mixed your guitars or piano or whatever this certain way for the intro, then you've completely changed it for this pre-verse. And then in this verse, you've changed it again. And then for this break, you've changed it again. And then for this chorus, you've changed the whole basic mix of what you were doing with the guitars again, to cause these certain effects. And all the different things the DAW can do can help you to do that. And you can do that with automation. It's just that that can be very complicated. So you writing things out of what you're doing with that so that you have we talked about that in Mixing Concepts, of having that written out really well so that as you go through the production and you get into mixing, that you go, what is going on there? I look at what did I do there? And so you really have good notes about what's happening. And because it's time consuming, it's tedious work, it can be frustrating, but you can do some really cool things like that make your production just sound like, wow. It's like during the verse it was like that, and then it changed for the chorus, and then for that break it was like, whoa, it was like all changed up, and then bam, back to the verse, back to, oh yeah, that is just cool. You can do a lot of cool things by changing up a whole lot of things that we've talked about so far in subgroup mixing. Just keep that in mind, and really keep in mind the things that I was trying to tell you that you need to consider that are going to be very important. Now, the other thing is we talked about, a spatialization preset that we put on all these subgroup buses that we had made when we were doing processing. Now, just remember that you have to be real careful with that on your out front tracks and your support tracks so that they get clarity. These tracks and these backing tracks that are really boundary, whether sometimes they're backing tracks or support tracks, that you can get away with a little bit more. But still be careful of getting mud, because behind that you might also have something like pad synths. I got a pad synth, that I've doubled and duplicated the track that's like 85 out right and left, but it's way back, and I've added a lot of spatialization effect of the spatialization preset we talked about, that's adding a wash back there, and that's cool because it's really blending back in there, and it's just creating this huge wide wash happening, and it's okay because all the other stuff sitting on top of it nice and clear. That adds this effect that there's this muddy wash in the background with this really cool clarity stuff sitting on top of it. And you just got to kind of keep that in mind, because in these tracks a lot of times it's either the guitar or the piano, and sometimes it can be both. You have the out front vocals 50 right 50 left, and you've got the harmonies to them, there's 65 right 65 left. You've got these guitars that are 75 right and left, and you've also got a piano working with it you've got out 85 right and 85 left. And we've talked about that. You've either mic'd it with two other really nice microphones, or you've duplicated the track and you've reprocessed it a little bit in the ways we've talked about to make it sound like it was captured from a different really nice microphone. So when you're doing that, because if you're not just doing like we talked about in Master Series 96, it's going to add more stereo field and width, but you got to also be careful of clarity, because you can only do so much with those things before it starts causing mud. And depending on how many instruments you have, then it can start, it's not definable to the listener, so that you do a bunch of really elaborate work, but you've got too much instrumentation going on for that type of elaborate work that it's just getting lost in the mix and nobody's ever going to hear it anyway. So really keep that in mind, because that's a huge thing. Because sometimes keep it simple, stupid is a good idea. That way everything is really preserves its clarity, and it's doing its job, and it's fulfilling its role, and it's heard well by the listener. And sometimes you can get away with things. Sometimes you got a break to where you got this guitar that, you've got a little bit of piano thing going on there, but for this break, you can just do a wall of sound for that guitar behind the vocalist and the harmonies. The vocalist and harmonies goes, ba-da-da, and you've got this wall of sound guitar behind it, or something going on there, that you can get away with that. And then you pull out of that and do a different thing happening for, the next movement, that's going on in the production. So just keep that in mind, because every section is like a separate mix. So because you can do different things with there to come up with different types of effects to do cool things. And besides that, it's a pretty simple thing. Just keep those in mind when you start working on these type of backing tracks, and it becomes more of a personal preference and your abilities to be able to hear what you like, to be able to do what you like, and to be able to accomplish that from experimentation on your part, figuring out what sounds good to you and what doesn't with the type of processing things that we've talked about so far. So I hope you enjoyed this video on backing tracks being like guitar and piano or something like that, the importance of those and the things to think about, and I will see you in the next video.